Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Feng Qiushi. Please call me Feng. I'm the acting vice dean of research, and it's really my pleasure to chair this book launch for Vineeta. And at the very beginning, I have to say very quickly about the SRN, which is Singapore Research Nexus. This is a project initiated in 2011. And it is SRN is considered as a very important research initiative from FASS and NUS in order to promote research in our faculty. We hope to create SRN as a showcase for the past research, a resource for the current research, and a platform for future research on Singapore. We publish actually weekly highlights of FASS research pertaining to Singapore and organize regular events to present faculty research and publications. We also put out collection of our research grant-funded research project. We also envision this platform as a very important resource for our scholars interested to work on Singapore. I hope you could participate in our activities more often. We are going to have the following events. Please look at this. This is our upcoming events at FASS. And the very first event, please pay attention. This one is for AUS internally only, okay? And the second one and the third one will be opening to the public. All right, I would like to formally introduce the author. Professor Vineeta Sinha is an ethnographer at heart and committed to qualitative research methodologies. In terms of disciplinary grounding, her work cut across multiple disciplines from sociology, anthropology, history, and area studies, which has enriched her approach to learning, researching, and teaching. The Department of Sociology and Anthropology at AUS is special to her for several reasons. This is where she was exposed, firstly as an undergrad and then master's student, and to the discipline of sociology and anthropology, and to a group of inspiring teachers. This is also a place where she practiced her research craft, teaching and undertaking sociology and anthropology research with great personal satisfaction. And a dual disciplinary grounding, which lie at the core of her intellectual inheritance, has enriched her training as an ethnographer and enable her to draw on the strengths of both fields of study. And a very brief introduction about this book. The notion of labor, mobility, and piety have a complex and intertwined relationship. Using ethnographical method and a historical perspective, Temple tracks critically outline the interlink of railway construction in colonial and post-colonial Asia, as well as the anthropology of infrastructure and transnational mobility with religion. Very lastly, I would like to say personally, this is my honor to chair this. And also, I also attend the very first book launch. I have to say personally, I'm very jealous that I don't have the chance to say something on this book. Now I have the chance, I have to say it. That is, I think this book not only is about academic work, but highly rooted in Vineeta's personal life. I know that her interest on railway construction actually highly related, in childhood, highly related to this book project. As a social scientist, I think this is almost the ideal research project to study something you become interested at childhood. And this is the perfect illustration of what an ideal scholar should do research. And then for that, congratulations, Vineeta. Thank you so much. Let us welcome Vineeta. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Qiushi, for a very warm and generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here. The book was actually published in August 2023, so it's been some years since then, and I've already moved on to other things. But I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk about the book in the place where the research was done. I think that's always very important to come back to. So I'm very happy to talk about the book here, and I'm very grateful to the FASS Research Division, especially to Rachel, who's sitting right here, for reaching out, and to the Singapore Research Nexus for creating a space for me to talk about the book. And thanks, Chusha, for moderating the discussion. So can you see that? Is it too glary, or is it okay? You can hear me, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So the book is called Temple Tracks, Labor, Piety, and Railway Construction in Asia. The book was in the making for many years. This, I think, is the book that took me the longest to write. And from the time that I actually conceived of the idea of doing the research to the actual culmination of it was probably a decade or so. And I'm quite embarrassed that it took that long. But life gets in the way of work. So, and of course, there was COVID to thank for. So it's taken a long time, but I'm very pleased that it finally came out. It's a cliche, but it really was a labor of love to do this, and I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to write this book. And as Chusha says, I mean, the book carries a lot of resonance for me, intellectual, but also biographical. The biographical aspect of it actually really came to me towards the end of the writing of the book. So it wasn't the motivation or the inspiration for writing the book, but it kind of interjected itself into the book quite unexpectedly. So, but I won't go into that. So let me start by saying, what actually prompted me to explore the connections between the histories of labor migration, the histories of railway construction in British Malaya, and of course, the practice of religion making, right? These are the three things that the book looks at. The project actually began with a seemingly simple empirical question. Why were there so many temples along the railway tracks as you traveled from Singapore to Malaysia, right? That was a simple kind of empirical question. This was a conspicuous scene even to the most casual travelers on the train in both directions, right? I mean, many of us in the room who have had the privilege of undertaking these train journeys will recognize that, right? So, for a start, it was the density of temples along the tracks, as well as their proximity to the railway premises that really intrigued my curiosity. And I was trying to figure out whether, this was a coincidence, or was there a deeper historical relationship of these temples along the tracks to the history of the railways in British Malaya. And that was really the kind of beginnings of this research. The project kind of came to life, ironically, however, precisely in those moments when the tracks were being removed from Singapore, right? So while I was aware of these temples along the tracks, and this was also a part of my earlier research on Hinduism in Singapore and Malaysia, it was when I witnessed the railway tracks being removed from Singapore across the island post, I think, 2011, July 2011, is when the tracks were actually physically being removed. And it was in the moment of actually witnessing the removal of the tracks that the project became so urgent, and I felt like, okay, this has to be done. So it was an irony that, when the tracks were being removed, I was beginning to ask historical questions about how did they get there in the first place, right? So that was sort of the further trigger. And of course, it triggered, historical questions about how did these tracks get there, who built them, why, and things like that. So the predictable kind of early response to the puzzle of the temples along the tracks pointed to Hindu and Indian railway laborers who were brought in from India by the British to lay these tracks, right, across the Malay Peninsula. Of course, they not only built railway tracks, but we know that this labor built ports, harbors, prisons, municipality, etc. And of course, they also came to work in the mining industry and the rubber plantations, etc. So, it's important that the Indian laborers worked together with indigenous Malay labor, migrant Chinese and Javanese laborers, as well as working class British navvies, which is actually something that's not talked about much in the labor historiography at all. For example, there was a group of navvies who actually came from Scotland and Ireland in the 1920s to build the causeway that links Singapore and Malaysia. And this is not talked about very much. So in my next project, that's what I'm going to work on. So the project really turned to labor, right? And if I had to say in one word what the book is about, it is about labor. It is about railway laborers. It's about trying to surface the laboring lives of labor, which is typically done in scholarship, but it's also to surface what I call in the book the non-laboring lives of labor, right? And it was pointed out to me that perhaps a better way to talk about the non-laboring lives of labor is to talk about the more than laboring lives of labor. And I do think that's a better description, but anyway, the book has been published. So in the book, I call it the non-laboring lives of labor, but really I'm talking about what else did labor do other than labor, right? And of course, my answer, at least one answer to that question is that, labor built temples. And I see these laborers as railway builders, but also as pioneering religion makers who constructed a sacred landscape for themselves, but who also laid the foundations for a sacred landscape of the future in Singapore and Malaysia, right? Because many of the things that they built are still around, right? Many have disappeared, but many are around. So let me start by speaking very briefly about railway construction in British Malaya, and this will have to be very brief and because of time. I've also experimented in this presentation in terms of having slides with no words on them. So it's largely pictures and maps and images. There might be one or two slides with words, so bear with me, but I'm going to try and see if I can tell a story or tell stories using just images, right? So now, of course, we know that the pattern and railway networks in Malaya were determined by the sites of the tin mining industry and its needs. So the growth of the rubber plantation economy in British Malaya intensified, and this led to the construction of a transportation network, including especially the train network. So in Malaya, the tracks were actually laid before the roads were, right? And prior to that, it was the waterways, canals, and that's quite interesting. So you had different things. So you had tracks, telegraphic lines, roads being built in that order, right? In Malaya. Which replaced, of course, the earlier rivers and waterways as traditional modes of transporting goods. So the building of a network of railways was undertaken primarily to link the mines and the estates with the coastal ports. And the earliest section was built in 1885. So here's a map. Let me see if it works. So where's the thing that lights up in red? There it is. Okay. So actually, the very first tracks that were laid in Malaya were in between the city of Taiping and Perak and Port Weld, and this was like a 12-kilometer stretch that led from the mines directly to Port Weld, right? And this was to get the tin out of Malaya into the global market, right? So the earliest section can be dated to 1885. Just to say that already at this time in the 1880s in Singapore, for those of you who are interested in Singapore, there were already trams and local train networks starting in the 1880s, right, which was quite developed through the early 1900s before being subsequently replaced by buses, which were introduced on the island. So there was like the Singapore Tram Company, there was the Kranji Electric Railway, in Singapore at the time before, but that was a separate set of railway networks. And this one is the one that I'm talking about, built by the British for linking Singapore through Malaya, through Thailand. That was the ambitious project, right? Land, rail connectivity across these places. So let me just go through this. So the earliest one was 1885. And then, prior to the setting up of the Federated Malay States Railways in 1901, there were different state railways in all the different states in Malaya. So there was one in Johor, there was one in Selangor between 1885 and 1900. And then in 1901, the Federated Malay States Railways is consolidated, and it has a life of 47 years. So this consolidated the existing railways into a single entity. The Malayan railways were then formed in 1948 and existed till 1962. It's the same network, it's just being called different things, right? And then in 62, it was called the Kereta Api Tanah Melayu. There was nationalization and Malayanization efforts that lasted between 62 and 92. And then, of course, in 1992, this was corporatized. It was entirely government-owned, and it was known as the KTM Berhad, right? Now, through these transformations, little changed because the original track was 1,700 kilometers on the, so when I say the West Coast, I'm talking about the line that goes from Johor Bahru all the way up here to the town of Padang Besar, which is the last town before you get into Thailand. And then the East Coast line starts from Gemas, and then it goes all the way up through Kelantan, not in Terengganu, interestingly, Kedah, and then it ends in the town of Tumpat, which is the last town before you get into the Thai-Malaysian border, right? And so of this, about almost 600 kilometers on the East Coast line and the rest on the West Coast line, with about 23 to 26 kilometers in Singapore. There's some dispute about how long the Singapore railways were, depending on how you counted and what you count and what you leave out. But roughly about 25 to 26 kilometers were in Singapore, right? And the tracks were built in 1 meter gauge, right? Those of you who know, the trains are built in different gauges. This was built to 1 meter gauge, so as to ensure continuity, not just through the peninsula, but also beyond, right? Because the British had grand plans to actually take this into Burma as well, right? A plan that unfortunately didn't materialize for reasons we know well. So the KTM railway network map up to June 2011 ran from Singapore all the way, the orange line, to Padang Besar, and then all the way to Tumpat on the East Coast. And of course, what happened in June 2011 was that there was a landmark agreement between Singapore and Malaysia governments, which returned this stretch of land. This is Singapore, right? So this stretch of land from Tanjung Pagar station that went all the way through woodlands into Johor Bahru, this stretch of land was physically in Singapore, but was not under the control of the Singapore government, right? So I've talked about this stretch of land in Singapore in my other work as the realm of possibilities, right? Which happened in Singapore, like all kinds of things happened here. I can't go into details, but people who lived on HDB estates along this stretch would do farming, they would keep chickens and turkeys and, you know, all of that, right? Things happened along the stretch, and people also built places of worship, right? So there were Chinese temples, there were Hindu temples, there were mosques, there were surahs, etc., that were built here. So in 2011, there was a very complex set of negotiations between the two governments, which meant that this land, this stretch of 26 kilometers that cut through Singapore was, which belonged to the railway company, was returned to the Malaysian government in exchange for other lands that Singapore received in return from Malaysia, right? And I won't go into the details, but we can talk about the actual details if you want. So it was given back. Now, this was the railway map of Singapore up to June 21 as well, right? Now, so what happened in June 21 was that the railway tracks across Singapore began to be removed. And this was, I was here, actually, this is one of my field sites. So this is this temple. Now, whenever you see red and white vertical lines on a building in Tamil Nadu and also in Singapore and Malaysia, it's, you know, there's a temple around, right? And so this was the site in Queensway. This is now along the railway corridor. It is known as the Queensway Node. I've just recently seen pictures of what they're going to do to this place, and it's quite disturbing, I have to tell you. I won't show you the pictures. It looks, okay, I won't tell you what it looks like either. So this is a very small temple right here, and the origins of this temple actually are traced back to 1935, when a Malaysian gentleman who was a superintendent known as a Mando moved into this building right next to it, right? These were the building next to the temple. These were the typical labor lines, coolie lines that were constructed all along the railway tracks, right? So this is where the tracks used to be. Literally, this is where I watched the tracks on this section being removed. It was quite heart-wrenching, but you know, this was removed, and then the lorry was taking away all the debris. These coolie lines is where the people who maintained the tracks were housed and they lived there, right? And so I speak of these tracks as their work sites, and of course these are their homes, and I think I speak of these as contiguous sites. There was very little difference between where they worked and where they lived because it was all in the same space, and wherever they lived, Hindu laborers from Tamil Nadu built temples. That was the main thing, right? Because there is a Tamil proverb that you should never live in a land when there are no temples. And so it's a kind of a story that everyone says with some amusement, that whenever you put 20 people from Tamil Nadu together, you can be sure there'll be a temple, right? And indeed, all along the 1700 kilometers on the west and east coast of the railways at 5-kilometer intervals, there were temples that were built. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of these temples, big and small. Some of them were demolished, of course, through the modernization, railway modernization projects. Many have been moved. Most have been demolished, but some have persisted, right? And that's what I was trying to do, to find out what remains, right, of these temples. So this was in 2012 when I took the photograph. Now, in terms of my methodology, I've talked about this in my classes, but also in my other writings. I mean, I talk about this idea of ethnography on the move, right? And I mean, this really speaks to the idea that my field sites were what I would call the railway and religious infrastructures that I encountered in my journeys, right? And a lot of it was along the railway tracks, right? So the temples were next to the tracks, so were the stations and the workshops and the depots and the station master's house, et cetera. I mean, these were the places that I hung out in. Now, I couldn't stay in any of these places. Of course, I traveled to particular stations in particular towns, and I stayed there for 2 days or 3 days, but I was constantly on the move. I had to be on the move in order to, because I was mapping temples along the entire stretch. My research was not just focusing on a small section of any place. I was seeking, and it was a very ambitious project. In the early days, I really wasn't sure if this would happen. Most of the fieldwork was conducted between 2017 and 2019. I was forced to stop the fieldwork because of COVID, and I actually have not been able to go back at all. I went back briefly in 21 when we could visit, Malaysia, and again, I saw lots of changes that have already taken place. So it was a kind of a sobering reminder to me that the work that I had done so recently actually had already become historical knowledge because it had disappeared, some of it. And that kind of reiterated to me the value of what I had been trying to do in the first place, right? So the research was, in the present of my fieldwork moments, I had to do the work. It seemed very urgent. I did fieldwork along the railway tracks, as I said. I was constantly on the move. I walked the tracks in places where the tracks were not electrified, thankfully. This is actually on the East Coast. And so, the East Coast track is, so just to bring you up to date, on the West Coast side, almost the entire network has now been electrified and modernized, and trains run at 140 kilometers an hour, right? Except for a still very small section between JB and Gamas that is still being worked on, and I'm told that it will finish by October this year. So if anyone wants to catch the old railways, you should do that now. But the place to really catch what the tracks were like before the modernization began is to go to the East Coast, right? This is where, the tracks are as they were. The East Coast lines were completed in 1932, and they used the same tracks. But I'm told that even on the East Coast line, the stations have changed. They've got new stations. The names of the stations have changed. The tracks are the same. They've now got fancier diesel engines, so they run a little bit faster than the 60 kilometers an hour that they were doing before. The journey from JB to Tumpat on the East Coast line takes 18 hours. You take the train from JB station at 6:30 p.m. and you arrive in Tumpat the next day at 12 noon, right? That's how long it takes to get there. And I've done that journey multiple times, but I also walked, right? I walked the length because none of these places that I was mapping were actually on any GPS radar at all, right? I had to literally walk and find these places. I also did, and let's see if this works. So that's the train. I'm not on the train, obviously. But this is in a place called Sentul, right? Which was it was the site of the largest railway depot in Malaya. And it housed, at its zenith, it housed 5,000 railway workers who were in the workshops, building different parts that were required to run the railways, right? And so, of course, there were temples, and this is one of the most famous temples in Sentul. So, and you can see right here, these are so that train was going at 120 or 130 kilometers an hour, right? And these are the electrical fences that have been set up to keep people out, because there's 25,000 volts of electricity that runs through those tracks, and you don't want to be inside. So I traveled by foot, of course. I traveled on the train, and that's my car, right? I had a little car, and I used to, after doing the train journeys, I used to drive the car on the road networks to get to the places that I had identified from the train. And that was harder to do. It was easier to see them from the train than, try to locate them from the roads, right? But that's what I did. This is my little car again. It's on a station. This station is called Mankibol in the state of Johor. This was in 2017. And this temple actually, this particular temple was already being destroyed when I got there. I'll show you some images of it later. The railway tracks are right there. And this actually is part of the railway station, right? So as the train moved out of the station and you kind of get off the station premises, you find the temple. And this was the case with many of the temples that I found, right? Where the temples were literally on the stations themselves, right? It was quite striking to see that. Okay, so I tried to, following this kind of foot journeys, car journeys, train journeys, I tried to map these sacred landscapes, right? So, of course, one of the questions when I first began to think about doing this research, which was asked of me by curious onlookers, was, well, are there still any temples left? Like, if there's been such modernization and everything has changed, like, what's the point of doing this if there are no temples left? And whenever I came back from my journeys and I reported that I had found this temple or this many temples, they were like, okay, that somehow seemed to legitimate the project. That, so despite the fact that, we talk about sort of not being empiricist, right? That seemed to be a driver for many people, like, how many temples did you find, right? As if that would justify the project. So this is what I found. So in my journeys, right, I found, I've categorized what I found in 3 types of temples. So one set of temples were dedicated to the deity Munishwaran, who's a guardian deity, a protector deity, with whom I've done research for many years now. And I found from Singapore to Padang Besar and to Tumpat, I found a total of 34 temples that were dedicated to the deity Munishwaran. I want to emphasize that these are temples that were functioning, active sites. They were not sort of remnants or, in a state of disrepair. They were actually functioning temples with viable, communities of devotees, right? Where people were maintaining them. There were festivals that were being organized here, and people were continuously coming back to these temples. And these temples were described, as all the temples in my journey, as railwaymen temples. That was the term that was used, right? So people would say, oh, you're looking for a railwayman temple, here's one. Or they would say KTM temple, right? These were the 2 descriptors that I heard. So there were 34 of these Munishwaran temples, right? And then I also found, Aman is God mother, so 37 mother goddess temples, right? Along the same sort of tracks that I was mapping, which was quite remarkable. I have to say that okay, let me just do this one first. And then I found, was it 21 temples for Sanskritic deities, the big deities, right? So the first 2 sets of deities are deities from the folk Hindu pantheon, right? And many of these temples started their life as shrines, and they were not built according to any kind of prescriptions, textual prescriptions or codifications. But of course, many of these have also grown into temples of that stature over time, right? Because they've moved out of the hands of railway laborers into other communities over time. And some of these temples have been there for the last 100 years, right? So the temples have definitely changed, but they still declare a commitment to the folk deities, right? That's important. And the mother goddess temples as well. Many of them have become sort of very large temples with Brahmin priests and all that. And of course, there were temples for Sanskritic deities. Now, these temples were actually founded not so much by the laborers, but they were actually founded by many of them members of the Ceylon Tamil Hindu communities, right, who were also brought in to work in the railway services in Malaya. And they were typically, part of the clerical staff, and they were sort of station masters and held sort of higher positions in the railway services hierarchy, right? So they had already built these early temples for big deities like Shiva and Murugan and, typically Shaivite temples more than. There were also many of them built by Chettiars who had supported them and who also had links with the railways, right? So in terms of the mapping exercise, I located 94 temples at the time that I finished my research in 2019. I'm not sure how many of these are still around, especially the smaller ones, which wouldn't have had the resources to withstand these kind of modernization, changes that were coming, right? And of course, in Singapore, the Singapore story is quite interesting, which I've been tracking for a longer time. Between Tanjong Pagar and Woodlands, I had identified 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 railwaymen temples in Singapore, all of them for the deity Muneeswaran. So there is a very clear kind of linkage between Muneeswaran and the railways. He's christened as the railway god, actually, right? Because, he has this kind of capacity to transform his protective qualities in any terrain. So while in India, he may have performed a certain function, in Singapore, he's been described as a SARS warrior. In fact, the cover of my first book, on Muneeswaran, which shows Muneeswaran riding a horse, was actually materialized by a devotee who was not an artist. And this was in 2002, when there was a SARS epidemic in Singapore, and they had conceptualized Muneeswaran as a warrior who could, help Singapore fight SARS as well, right? And of course, the railways were particularly challenging work sites because they were harsh, inhospitable, dangerous conditions. And so all of the people that I spoke to talked about how it was very important for them to have protection from this deity, and they felt that he was well suited to provide that protection. So Muneeswaran is a deity who's very intimately entangled with the history of the railways in British Malaya. This is not the case in India, by the way, right? Which really tells us about how the specifics of particular places and topographies actually produce imaginations of deities. And this is a folk deity, so there's no script about him, right? The script is written by the people who worship him, right? And the script changes all the time. Sometimes he's a SARS warrior, sometimes he's a railway god, right? Okay. And then, so I've talked about this, the idea of temples, homes, and workspaces being aligned. So these are the only 2 slides with words on them. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Railway Engineering Department, which was the largest department in the railway services, right? And the workforce was constituted almost entirely of South Indian migrant labor. There were, of course, indigenous Malay workers in the railway services, but most of them were not in the engineering services. They were elsewhere. And this included Tamil, Telugu, and Malayali labor, and combination of convict and indentured labor as well. Now, the engineering department and the railways relied on what I've described as the manual track maintenance methods well into the 1980s. So what were these methods? So the railway tracks across Malaya were divided into 5-kilometer segments, right? And at every 5-kilometer stretch, there would be 12 to 14 workers together with a supervisor who would be housed there. They would live there. These were the coolie lines. These were the railway lines, the labor lines, right? And the people who worked along these tracks. So what was track maintenance? So every morning, the laborers would walk 5 kilometers in one direction, checking to see that everything was in order. Right now, of course, if you see railways, you see there are machines that do this, right? There are these vehicles that go up and down the tracks. But these guys used to walk, And this manual track maintenance literally used hands and feet, right? And they would check every nail, check every nook and cranny to make sure there were no cracks on the sleepers, or that nothing was out of line. So and the Malayan Railways actually used this method well into the 80s, right? They only stopped using this because by the 80s there was a real shift in the way that the railway services were organized, and a large number of Indian laborers were retired and not replaced, right? And they also then switched to doing using more mechanical methods, right? So the railways housed its staff, especially track maintenance workers, and these are the people who were the large bulk of the people that I spoke to in my project, right? The permanent way workers, the track maintenance people, and they lived close to the workspaces. So the labor organization was such that there were gangs of 10 to 12 with a foreman responsible for maintaining a section of 4 to 5 kilometers of the tracks. This was the daily regimen. So they would walk this way and they would walk that way, right? Every day they would do this, right? So it was very grueling work. These railway gangs were housed in coolie lines, again, at intervals of 4 to 5 kilometers along the entire stretch of the permanent way. And of course, you know, in this book, I discovered a lot of parallels between the way that the British railway navvies were treated back in Britain, but also to other places. The British navvies actually traveled everywhere. They were very global, and they went to China. Sorry, not to China. They went to, I mean, the Chinese navvies also went. They went to Canada. They went to parts of Africa. And they also came to Southeast Asia to help build infrastructure. And that's what I'm wanting to work on next. And I found a lot of parallels between the way that the British railway navvies were treated and the railway laborers in the colonies were treated, right? There were lots of parallels between the two, and I find this work quite exciting. There's a popular Tamil saying, do not live in spaces where there are no temples, and therefore you see the pattern of building temples close to workspaces and living spaces, including along the entire stretch of the tracks. I have to say that this 4 to 5 kilometers was throughout the entire network, including in places that were inaccessible, right? So these labor lines existed in places where there was no water, there was no electricity, there was no nothing, right? Very poor living conditions. Let's not even talk about sanitary and hygiene. It was just, those were non-existent. It was never part of the story. So as a result of this, there were a lot of disease and death in these coolie lines because people just didn't have access to any kind of healthcare. So how could this be possible, right? In a colonial context, you might ask. Well, the British generally, in these parts of the world, right, in British Malaya, they generally had a very liberal attitude towards the religious life of the natives. They tolerated them, right? Not only did they tolerate them, they even participated in many of the temple activities. So the white man would come. It's not my language. This is the way my interlocutors, they would say the white man would come and they would give us a goat for Diwali, or they would give us a sack of rice for, you know, particular festival. And not only that, the British also made grants of land available to different native communities for building places of worship, and not just Hindu temples. So in fact, the other story that I'm not able to tell here is the building of Sikh gurdwaras all along the railway tracks as well. Those also exist because large numbers of Sikhs came to work in the railway services. They were not part of the permanent way workers, but they were in the police and the military. That's what they were. So they were part of the railway police. There's a long history of that, watchmen and all of that. And so Sikh gurdwaras also found all across the tracks. So they gave land. Now, in terms of the actual ability to build temples next to the track, right? How could this be possible? So they granted these temporary occupation licenses, right? So here's one from 1947, right? Which says, a permit for the temporary occupation on site in the railway reserve Saramban, right? Mr. S. Kanusami Mando is like a supervisor, Mando gardeners gang. So these gangs were for different things, right? They could be gardeners gangs. There were other gangs for you know, people who were light men, who were people who changed tracks, right? All kinds of specific. Railways, Ramban is hereby permitted to occupy from each month to month on the first day of May, an area of 49,500 square feet. That's quite a large space, right? In the railway reserve for the purpose of erecting a Hindu temple, right? At the rental of $1. This was one straight dollar, which was worth a lot more than our $1 today, per annum, paid in advance to the station master each year, right? I want to say that this I discovered not in the official archive. This I discovered, this was given to me by this particular temple, which continues in Seremban, and they took me to the storeroom in the temple and opened a trunk, kind of a metal trunk, out of which came out all these files, including some silkworms, which really frightened me, not for myself, but for the life of the documents. And this came out from there, right? I didn't find this anywhere, either in the literature or in the archives. And then, of course, this practice continued. So this did not end with the British, right? So the temporary occupation license practice continued. So this is a similar kind of a license given out in 1975. It's written in Malay. It's for the same temple, right? And, but it's now the Kereta Api Tanah Melayu. It's no longer the Federated Malay States Railways. And, the price has gone up to 10 ringgit. I found that the prices varied enormously. Some people were paying 10, some people were paying 100. It depended on how large the premises were, et cetera. But the practice continued. In fact, the practice still continues. In 23 December, when I held a book launch for this book on the premises of the Bukit Timah railway station. I actually had the book launch at the station itself, the very first one. I had to pay a temporary occupation license for the right to erect a tent and to actually have an event there, right? So talk about historical continuities. And it was called a temporary occupation license. I had to pay a fees. I paid less for the fees. I paid more for the tentage, but that's another story. Okay, and so let me just show you some examples of temples embedded within railway premises. So this is an image from the Tanjung Pagar station in Singapore. It was a Muneeswaran temple, predictably. Here are the tracks. Right at the end, you can't see behind this is what's called a turntable, where the trains use. So this was like right at the end, the trains would come here, and then at the train table, they would be reserviced, and then they would be ready to go back, right? And there was a temple right there. This temple, of course, after the station was closed down, had to move. It first moved to a temporary site in Upper Bukit Timah on the top floor of a Chinese temple, and it was there for a few years. And then I think there were some issues with the tenancy, and so it moved out to several other places. For some time, the deities went into storage in Johor Bahru, but then now they're back. So they have now moved to another Chinese temple in Changi in Kampong Ubi, right? So the temples are also on the move here. So that's one example. This is, again, the Monkey Bull station that I mentioned in Johor. I mean, I just wanted to show you the proximity of the tracks to the temples. I mean, they were just right there. Here's one from Kluang in Johor, in a place called Kampong India, which housed a lot of these railway workers, but they have all been, the whole estate has gone. So, the temple has gone as well. Again, like you can literally, it's like barely 20 meters away, right? You can just walk there. This, of course, is in Singapore. I've talked about this already. This temple put up some dogged resistance in Singapore. But if I want to talk about any sort of instance of resistance in my research, this is where it comes from. So this temple was given notice to move when the tracks were being removed. As with all other occupants of this land, they're the only one who refused to move. And they put up a fight for 5 years, right? So from 2012 to 2017, they refused to move, and they wrote to everybody, including to various members of parliament and political authorities, etc. But the land, this land was not zoned for religious purposes, right? And so it actually belongs to JTC, Jurong Town Corporation, and Singapore Land authorities, and it was forced to go. I mean, eventually they just had no choice but to leave. This temple, unfortunately, has not found another physical home, but it has migrated to cyberspace, which happens a lot. This is the station called Layang Layang, which is also in Johor. This is the outline of this is the front of the Mando's house. So the Mando had a slightly bigger, living space, right? But it was already all walled up, and it was being demolished. This is the temple that he had. So this is the house of the Mando, and this is the temple that he had built right next door. And you can't see the tracks. They are there, but you can tell the tracks are there because the telegraphic lines are running right above the tracks, right? Here are the machines that are destroying. Okay, and so in in the book, I talk about tracing as method and tracing as theory, and allow me to say a few words about that, right? So tracing as method for me has been very productive because the book has tried to demonstrate the value of using this idea of tracking as a methodological and conceptual device for making evident signs and ciphers of both the laboring and non-laboring lives of railway labor. So identifying footprints of economic, sociocultural, religious, and political practices, particularly in their more abstract and symbolic manifestations, is a challenge epistemologically for the social sciences. However, I argue that the practice of tracing not only allowed me to identify these religious and railway infrastructures, but also carried a lot of theoretical value for my work. So my turn to tracing as method and theories has enabled me to map both the visible and the indiscernible features of religious and railway infrastructures, right? So you see what you see, but in the traces, you also don't see what's not there, right? Recognizing the traces and footprints of these infrastructures have been the most engaging and thought-provoking facets of this journey. My research has led me to conceive of traces in multiple registers, and it's not just the physical and material traces, but includes recollections, individual and social collective memories, as well as digital signs, right? But I do not approach traces as residual, ephemeral fragments of a more complete, authentic totality that existed once upon a time. I look at traces as weighty and analytically substantial in and of themselves. So these are layered and textured. They embody accumulated meanings and histories, and the manifestations are mediated by multiple intersecting temporalities. So I proposed tracing as a method for unearthing visible, invisible, and marginal terrains along my journey. So, of course, I took inspiration in this from the work of Amitav Ghosh in An Antique Land, where he talks about this idea, right, that, there are some people who have the power to inscribe themselves physically upon time, right? But what about those who don't? And here he refers to the slave of Khalaf's letter. And, I was very inspired to read these words that, how do we get to those barely discernible traces that ordinary people leave upon the world, which happen to have been preserved? It is nothing less than a miracle that anything is known about him at all. And I can really say that about the temples that I encountered, right? I mean, the fact that I saw these 94 temples under the conditions that I did, it was really a miracle that anything was left over of this time even, right? And so I was very intrigued to sort of struggle epistemologically with this question of, what are these traces and how does one access them and how does one read and interpret these traces? So of course I saw physical material traces. So this is the Palo station in Johor. And these are where, I mean, I was very fortunate to be able to see this. So the temple was right here. And this is a temple that I had actually seen on the railway platform along one of my journeys, many years prior to actually doing the research. And this is the boundary wall of the temple. Now there's a lot of vegetation, but this is where the deities, some of the deities used to be sited, right? The temple is gone, of course, and so has the station. There's nothing that's left. The temple is gone in the sense that it's gone from the station, but it was a big established temple, so it's moved to a town nearby, right? So it's still around in that sense. This is the Monkey Bowl temple that I had mentioned earlier, and time has stood still right there, and everything is falling apart, behind everything. I mean, I was there to actually see this happening. And then, of course, there are spatial imaginaries, right? So in addition to those kinds of, I mean, I have lots of images, but I can't go through them. And then this is from my notebook, excuse the handwriting, but one of the things I did in my journey was that apart from these physical traces, I was also looking for how people remembered these things, right? So this idea of a temple map emerged in conversation with my interlocutors, right? I can't say that it's mine entirely, right? As we talked about, where we used to sit for hours and just, they would it was like they had a map of the tracks in their mind, and they would use the stations as coordinates, and they would say, oh yeah, there's a temple next to this station, right? So then what I did was like, I got them to articulate these temple maps. And so I have a lot of these maps that I collected. And then, these maps were very helpful, not just for demonstrating how traces persist in kind of indiscernible modes as memory, but these were very useful for fieldwork as well, right? Because I then tracked them and I went to these places to see if they were actually there, and many of them were there. So you can see, right, like this was the list I came up with. And then after I had been to those temples, I would say railway temple, question mark, I would say yes. So this is the yes, yes, no, no are all sort of a result of my journeys, right? When I actually went to the temples and I was like, oh, is this real? Yes. Because there was no guarantee that just because the temples were along the tracks that they were railwayman temples. I was interested in those that had been built by the laborers, which is very different from the temples that were built in the rubber estates, for example. In the rubber estates, many of the temples were actually built by the estate owners themselves for the benefit of their workers, right? Whereas these temples that the railway, along the railway tracks, were actually built by the laborers themselves. So I found it quite intriguing that, these people were brought to Singapore and Malaysia. They didn't know they were going to be building railways, right? Because presumably they would be just told you're going there, and they didn't know what work they would do. They would come here and then they would just be farmed out to wherever. So they ended up accidentally in the railways. So they came, that they didn't know how to build the railways, and they learned. Neither did they know how to build the temples, and they learned, right? So, you have like the same one constituency that built two sets of infrastructures, the religious and the railways. And I was just so fortunate to be able to capture, that effort. This is this is at Keppel, the same temple. It's the Tanjung Pagar station, but it's in Keppel Road. Now, this has been cordoned off, so you actually can't see what's happening inside, but it's part of the rail corridor project, so they're preserving it in some form. I'm not sure what exactly is going to be done. I believe they're building in the distance, you can see the colonial station there. It's a beautiful building, but I think they're building some kind of like underground railways or something. The reason why I wanted, this is the picture when the temple was still around. Here's the sign of the temple. You can't see it very clearly. This was taken before 2012. This is the picture that was taken in 2015 on the same site, right? It's the same tree, but the temple's gone. But guess who's still here? The devotees, right? I think they still do that, although now the whole place looks even more different than this. But this group of devotees still continue to go back to this site because, the place for them is energized with accumulated powers of the deity, right? So even if the physical manifestation of the temple is gone, the place matters. And so they would regularly go back and conduct prayers at this site. And I just thought, I actually wanted to put this on the cover of the book, but then I found a better picture. Okay, and then of course there are digital cyber traces. So I mentioned some of the temples have been moved, some of the temples have been demolished. Those that couldn't be moved to physical locations have moved into cyberspace. So this is the temple from Queensway Close. They have set up a Facebook site, and the community exists here. They used it to announce events and all kinds of things. I didn't check recently how many followers they have, but they have quite a few. This was a more recent picture. Railway Temple preserved the shrine at Queen's Close. This was in 2017 when they were still trying to, fight the authorities to keep the shrine here, but didn't in the end. And then this is the temple from the Tanjung Pagar station, which moved to Bukit Timah into the Chinese temple. They've also migrated to cyberspace, although they have a presence in this Chinese temple. So if anybody wants to go, it's here. It's in this temple. The last I checked, it had 10,000 followers, right? And so it really galvanizes people and reaches out to members that may not have been there. So this is basically the project in a very brief nutshell. I wanted to, this is another image of the same temple. It's functioning, you can go there, it's open every day. It's now being, unfortunately, the priest who used to run this temple passed away prematurely, but his son, who's a graduate of FASS NUS, now runs the temple. So it's quite interesting that he's decided to do that. So thank you so much for listening. I really just wanted to present a kind of a snippet of the research, and that's all I've been able to do. But essentially, the project foregrounds labor, railway labor, and the fact that they built two sets of infrastructures as part of the same project of colonial capitalism. They are not separate parts. It's not like the temple building is part of a, sort of cultural effort, right? I present these, the building of the railways and the building of the temples as the same project of colonial capitalism, right? And it's remarkable that a sacred landscape grew under the shadow of colonial capitalism, which has had so much longevity. Many of the old railway equipment is now being retired because it's being modernized. Railways are being modernized. The tracks are gone, the trains are gone, the laborers are gone. Guess what continues? The temples, right? And that's quite an irony, because one would have thought that the hardware of railway infrastructure would outlast the intangible and the more abstract temples, right? Both in terms of their durability as well as the abstract symbolic. But it turns out that the temples actually have a longer shelf life compared to the hardware of the railways themselves, many of which have retired, have disappeared, and you can't recognize, if you travel on the West Coast now, on the train, you can't recognize what the earlier landscape used to be. Right? It's completely changed it. Whereas my mapping of the sacred landscape suggests that people can still recognize, right, some aspects of that, because it's not only available in a physical material form, but it has become a part of the individual and social imaginary and consciousness. And people tell stories, which give it another life. So thank you so much for listening.
Questions? Yeah, half an hour. Please.
So, Prof, this is about labor, right? So I'm curious about their political activity because their life is quite harsh.
Yes.
And I just wonder if the temple is the way they exit from the reality usually, because it's really harsh. So yeah, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think the point, one of the points I was trying to make in this project was not to think about labor only in terms of their laboring lives, right? And I was trying to argue that, they lead ordinary lives, and I was trying to focus on their everyday lives, and laboring and working was just a small part of what they did, right? They did many other things too. On weekends, they went to the movies, they played sports, they got together and played cards, they did a whole lot of things. So I was trying to actually capture what they did in the business of day-to-day living. And typically when we talk about laborers, we tend to focus on them as productive units, and we only think of them in terms of their capacity to deliver work, right? But I was trying to say that there's more to the laborers' lives than just laboring, right? And so religion making was a part of it. Now, the temples were not desegregated from their everyday life. They were very much entangled with everything that they did. And so I don't think it was any kind of escapism in that sense. I think it was very much connected to the here and now for them. Yeah. Hi, Nina. Yes.
Thank you for the wonderful talk and great book as well. I was wondering if you could give us a picture a little bit of what festival season would look like and what that pilgrimage route, how were the trains and the temples used along the way?
Yeah, thank you. So the festival scene was actually, so most of these temples, when they first began, were built outside the frames of what we call agamic temples, right? So they didn't adhere to a ritual calendar of the big temples. It's interesting that until 1948, members of the untouchable communities could not access the agamic Sanskritic temples in Singapore and Malaysia. Just as in India, they were very serious, as you know, bans on temple entry, right? So they couldn't, so in a sense, they had to build their own temples. And most of the people I'm talking about came from the lowest rungs of Indian caste and class hierarchies, right? So they built their own temples. And so their festivals actually mimicked the ritual calendar of folk Hinduism in rural Tamil Nadu or Telangana, Andhra or Kerala, right? So the most important event in the ritual calendar was the annual temple festival, the Tiruvillas, right? Those were the main things. And then in addition, they did, like the goddess temples did firewalking. Many of the other temples did Thaipusam as well. They did Diwali, of course, Deepavali, but they didn't actually adhere to the agamic calendars. The folk popular Hindu scene had its own list of festivals that they adhered to. Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I actually, this is a question in the making, but you ended with a conclusion about capitalism and religion and how it's surprising that one outlives the other in this case. But I was thinking if you have something to offer to the question about sort of imperial capital and religion and neoliberal capital and religion, because in my own work, which looks at another space, but also looks at pilgrimages and capitalist development in the Himalayas, I often now increasingly find how roadside shrines, when road projects are developed, are not destroyed, but are incorporated into sort of a touristic pilgrimage complex, right? And that's how sort of neoliberal capital also works its way through these sites, through these areas, through religion. So I was wondering if you have a sort of a broader conceptual offering to make between relationships between imperial capital and religion and sort of neoliberal capital and religion through your own work.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I've wrestled with that in this book. So, ironically, I've argued that ironically, in the colonial context, right, imperial capitalism was much more amenable to sharing land with religious communities, right? They made land available through grants. They allowed people to build temples, mosques, gurudwaras and stuff like that. And I think that's partly because capitalism and the railway infrastructure represented by these capitalist interests and the sacred landscapes, they grew in tandem. Right? They grew together. It was almost a simultaneous kind of, just because when you talk about 1885, you're looking at capitalism in its early formations, and it was very different. It didn't have that clout and that kind of command and authority, or even the resources that it has now, right? Or had subsequently. And so they grew in tandem, and there seemed to be a greater willingness on the part of the colonial authorities to be amenable to these interests and to sharing resources and making things available to the communities in the form of financial support, in the form of licenses, in the form of land and other kinds of support. But I've argued that in the neoliberal post-colonial context, right, where capitalism has already acquired a certain standing and authority, quite a bit of dominance, right, there is a great deal of intolerance to making any accommodations to anybody else. Right? So all across Singapore and Malaysia, the modernization projects are just completely categorical in denying anybody else the right to use certain kinds of land, for example, right? It's just, and I found that quite ironic that in a colonial context, you had capitalist interests which were willing to see how they could work with a pre-existing or an emerging kind of a landscape, cultural, religious landscape, whereas in a post-colonial context, right, there seemed to be no room for negotiation at all, right? When the land is marked for, clearing everything that's not supposed to be there, you just clear it, right? There've been some good stories, successful stories of how, neoliberal capital has actually integrated existing religious worldviews, right? A very good example is from KL, my favorite example from Kuala Lumpur in the Mid-Valley City Mega Mall, where an old temple was earmarked for destruction, but the mall owners, they wanted to build a mall, found a way to integrate the temple into the mall architecture. And it's just amazing how they've done that. And not only did they allow the temple to stay, they financed and sponsored it as well. So I think there are some stories where interests of neoliberal capital, are aligned with the interests of other sort of religious cultural imaginaries. But overall, I would say that for me in this project, the colonial context seemed to be much more enabling for building and forging these relationships for whatever strategic instrumental reasons. I'm not saying that they were bowled over by what the natives were doing, far from it, right? But for the moment, they were willing to suspend both their commitment to the civilizing mission as much as the interests of capital. Whereas in the neoliberal post-colonial context, I think it's just capital interest all the way. Yes, Maitri.
Thanks so much. I was wondering if you could there was some, sure, some of the way the temples were they oriented towards the tracks, or were they oriented towards the interior, as to say? I mean, the reason I asked that is I was wondering about what's the story about how these temples become sort of part of this corridor, but then they become part of the communities or the spaces
Yes.
within. How did that happen, actually? And did these temples have an orientation towards each other along the track, or were they sort of seen as separate entities, even though they might have the same deity and so forth? So I'm kind of interested in the relationships
Yes.
amongst the temples, but
Yeah.
also towards the interior communities, so that this is to explain why you have people still devotionally approaching a space as opposed to a physical temple.
Right. Thank you. So the orientation of the temple. So although these temples were not built according to codified agamic principles, there is an understanding that it is auspicious to build a temple facing eastwards, right? That's the main thing. So wherever the east was, that's where the orientation would be, especially the sanctum of the principal deity, right, has to face east. I mean, so that I think was the primary kind of factor that determined which way the temples were facing. The other factor was that, so yeah, we talk about the interior communities, but for many of these temples, they were emerging at a time when there were no other communities around, right? I mean, they built the communities through the temple, right? So there wasn't like a pre-existing, community that was in the town or whatever, because these places that the mines were completely uninhabited in some ways, right? I mean, of course, people lived in other places, but they were not necessarily along the railway tracks. In fact, when the tracks were laid, there was already then, right, a huge process of land grabbing and evacuation of existing communities from there. So the communities, in a sense, also grew in tandem with the temples themselves. But it was the east-facing thing. In terms of the connections between temples, basically, they didn't take that into account when they were building the temple, but there was tremendous awareness about what the different temples were. Because remember, they were not very far away. They were just 5 kilometers away. And there was a lot of kind of crossing over as well. So people from other sort of neighborhoods would come to other temples for festivals and things like that. And this question hasn't come up, but perhaps it will. One always gets asked, what about caste, right? So let me just raise it myself, which always gets asked. In this context, of course, the people that I was talking to came from, many of them from the untouchable communities, right? But not only from untouchable communities, there were also some middle castes, present, not any Brahmins, but certainly middle castes who were amongst the laboring communities themselves. And I felt that there was one set of solidarity which transcended other differences. And this solidarity was given by the fact that they were all in the railways. Right? And this has been documented in railway communities in other places as well, where how people who work in the railways build a kind of solidarity. I mean, there's a certain connectedness, which comes also from the whole civil service logic as well that the British put in place in parts of Africa and India. But there was this sense of solidarity as railway men. And it was a very gendered space, I have to tell you. I mean, of the 94 temples that I interviewed, that I researched, I found only 7 women interlocutors, right? And these were like either daughters or wives or granddaughters of male laborers who had founded these temples, and they were running it, right? But most of my interlocutors were men in their 60s and 70s, right, who had retired from the railways and who continued to care for these temples after retirement. So caste actually didn't seem to matter. It transcended language. It transcended ethno-linguistic background. So I had like Tamil men, Malayali men, and Telugu men, all working in the same temple, attending to a deity from Tamil Nadu. So it really didn't surface in my own sort of work. Yeah. Caste, that is. Yeah.
Hi, I have the microphone, so I'll just jump in. Sorry. Great talk. I really enjoyed it. And I'm wondering if, given how popular well, I don't know if you nest in anthro in this book or not, but anthro of infrastructure has become quite trendy. I wonder if your work here speaks to anthro of infrastructure or theories of infrastructure. Are these temples an infrastructure? And if so, to what? And does that correlate with these moments of resistance that you find, or if they're not connecting to anything anymore. They're more likely to fade away. And are they an infrastructure towards political claims, the way that temple building in Buddhism can be a form of, a way of colonizing spaces? Were there other claims that allow them to remain kind of vibrant spaces throughout those years?
Yeah. Thanks, Elliot. So yeah, I mean, the work is totally plugged into the anthropology of infrastructure. I definitely use infrastructure as a lens for looking both at sacred landscapes and railway landscapes, right? And I argue that the same lens can be used for both. So I'm not talking about a different kind of infrastructure. And the work has actually led me to reconceptualize what we mean by infrastructures themselves, right? So I don't think of infrastructures only in terms of the logistical, the procedural, and the kind of the arrangements, the nuts and bolts, right, which lay the foundation for something else to happen. I look at infrastructure in terms of the more intangible aspects of it as well. I mean, and symbolic, right? So infrastructures, are animated with energies and efficacies if you're talking about railway, sacred landscapes. So yeah, I mean, of course, anthro of infrastructure is not new, although it's become very fashionable in the last 15 years or so. But, if one looks at the history of anthropology and looks at STS studies from the 80s and 90s, right? I mean, Susan Starr wrote a very important article on infrastructure and anthropology. So it's been there, but it's now become very fashionable. And I'm not saying fashionable in a bad way. I mean, I think it's a really good thing that anthropologists are now writing about oil and electricity and roads and waterways and canals, right? I mean, we never thought of these as objects of inquiry. So I've definitely learned a lot from that. And this book definitely, uses the lens of infrastructures. And I've tried to reconceptualize what we understand by infrastructures by insisting that one can look at sacred landscapes using the same lens, but rethinking what that lens is. Yes, Sinha.
Thank you, Prof. Sinha, for your presentation. So I think we have seen many very concrete empirical data, like the number of temples and all different kinds of temples you discovered. So I want to, maybe you can explain more about what the story after all this ethnography is telling. So is it maybe for how it is meaningful for the workers? Is it a story about how they make meaningful lives while working, or is it more about how different maybe say religious structures or other actors are promoting workers to construct sacred landscapes or others? Or I know somehow the story must be all of this, but in your case, which story you think is more important, and how does the fact you mentioned at the end that the hard railway is disappearing, but what is still exists is these temples. So yeah, just want to know what the story.
Thank you. Thanks. So you're right. Yeah, there are many stories one can tell about this, right? And indeed, I encountered many interesting stories through this. Maybe I'll start by saying what story I think it's not telling. And I think the story that it's not telling is about resistance, right? So sometimes when we talk about laborers, we talk about subalterns, we think about, their practices as practices of resistance, and that they are sort of either being mobilized by other groups to do something, or they are on their own, fighting against some existing sort of, mainstream authority position or something like that. I mean, that was not part of the story that surfaced for me. I don't present these railway making, temple making efforts as resistance to colonial authority. I mean, that just is not part of the story that I'm telling at all, right? Because and I say that with the awareness that it can be read that way, right? You can talk about laborers and you can think of them as subaltern, the downtrodden, and of course they were subjected to all kinds of authoritarian politics and colonial politics and all of that. They were at the bottom of the barrel, right? I mean, they didn't lead a good life at all. But I was trying to and actually, I should not say I tried to present the stories that they wanted to tell me, right? So it wasn't so much my story, it was what story they were telling me, right? And their stories often centered around this idea of wanting to connect with the places they found themselves in, right? And so temple building became a way of asserting a connection with the homes they had left behind. And the temples became a way of through their gods, etc., became a way of connecting with the families they had left behind. Because many of these temples actually were built for household and family deities of these individuals, right? And these deities are constant, right? So they felt that in building a temple for their household or family deity in Malaya, in a different place, that they were somehow still connected with the lands they'd left behind. So that was a very kind of important part of the story that my interlocutors were trying to tell me, and that's what I tried to communicate. None of them ever talked about their temple building efforts as resistance, right? They never did. They always talked about the British as very benign, as very tolerant, as very supportive, and all of those things. Subsequently, when I interviewed all these men who had by then retired in 2017 and 2019, the temples themselves took on a very different resonance, which was not there when the temples were first built. They were built for very different reasons. You might even say very, very practical reasons in terms of, these people didn't have very much else to do. The temples became a focus of community life. It built solidarities. It allowed them, gave them some satisfaction, some protection, contentment, and those kinds of things. But it was very striking to me that when I was doing interviews with these men in their 70s, many of whom had been in the railways their entire life. Some of them had started when they were 15 and they'd lied that they were 18, and then they worked in the railways for the next 50 years, right? They had retired, and then they began to talk about the temples and railway connection in highly political terms, which was not, I think, part of the earlier motivation, right? So, and that had a lot to do with the kind of contemporary ethnic political scene in Malaysia, and how the Indian community, members of the Indian community, some segments of the Indian community, I have to be very careful, in Malaysia feel aggrieved, feel that they haven't kept up, or that they haven't been able to keep up with the mobility of other communities, and many of them feel very disenfranchised. And so the temples then, in 2017, when I was talking to my interlocutors, became symbols of the contributions that Indians had made to building Malaysia, right? That's how they talked about it. But that's not how they were thinking about it when they were building the temple, right? But they, and that was also part of the sort of, I guess, unhappiness, that they feel like they did so much to build Malaysia, right? By building railways, and look at where we are today, right? We should have more recognition, we should have more importance, this should be documented, this should be talked about, etc. So the stories themselves change over time, even within the story. The story is never the same, right? So at one point in time, you might think, this is why I'm doing it, but then, decades later, you reflect on it and you think, okay, and the temples really became symbols of evidence, right? That the Indians were important at this point in history, but we're not important today. So it became very politicized, yeah. And I hadn't anticipated this when I first started the research, that the book would end on that note, but the book actually ended on this particular note, that, I mean, they even thanked me for doing the research, because they said, this idea that one should remember, right? That one should not forget the contributions that the Indian community has made, literally, to building Malaysia and Singapore.
There was a hand up on Zoom.
There is a question on Zoom.
Oh. Where is that question?
Question from Jonathan. Yeah, please read.
Question from Jonathan. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the really valuable stories and lessons of your presentation about the book. I'd like to ask some questions to Ms. Vineeta. How does your book approach the tension between development and the preservation of sacred spaces? And what lessons can contemporary urban planners and policymakers learn from the cases presented in your book, Temple Tracks? Thank you.
Oh, well, yeah, of course the tensions are there. And of course, this is not just about railways, but it's about urban development in general. It happens everywhere, right? When you have kind of so-called symbols of modernity confronting pre-existing landscapes, and how does one deal with that? So as I said, I mean, in some cases we have successful stories of how one can integrate pre-existing, landscapes into a kind of a modernist framework. But in some cases, I think in most cases, that does not happen. In terms of what they can learn, or they should read the book, for sure. No, and I say that seriously. Just this morning, I had a meeting, right, with someone, and I was talking to them, and they were sharing with me some plans for the rail corridor, which is still in the making, and some of these plans, honestly, this is on Zoom and being recorded. Never mind. Quite disturbing. I mean, it's quite disturbing to think about, the master plan, and how the master plan in some ways doesn't seem connected, or doesn't seem to want to connect with histories, with complexities, with legacies. I mean, even when they speak the language of heritage, it's a very carefully curated, sanitized, kind of a view on things. And so it would be good to have more conversations, surely, with people who know about these complex histories and things like that. And I think, I mean, there are creative examples of how these worlds have been integrated without really compromising, the kind of neoliberal capital project in that sense, right? It can be done, but there are very successful examples of this. I don't want to sound Eurocentric, oh my God, but they're very, Mauritius, that's a good example. In Mauritius, they're very good examples of this, right? I mean, for example, they have a day called Indentured Day. They celebrate an Indentured Day where they observe the arrival of the indentured laborers to Mauritius, who were the pioneering, right? In many parts of the world, people don't even want to acknowledge that laboring communities played an important role, right? It's something to be stigmatized, it's something to be ashamed of, it's something to be embarrassed. I won't name which parts of the world.
All right, if no more questions, any questions? Last question? Oh, please.
Hi,
Yeah.
Sumit.
Are you running out of time?
No.
No,
We are
we can, sure, please. Well, I'd like to sit down.
Couple of hours to look at all the different kinds of conversations your book has, and I can see why it's drawn attention. And you've had conversations in Europe and in the US as well before you had this conversation here. But so there are lots of those expansive areas and different disciplines that would interest me. But I want to maybe just locate myself in Malaysia for a bit for this question, just to find a focus. So the question of resistance came up, right? So
Right.
You don't talk about that explicitly, but what you've done is you've documented the story of a god who smokes a cheroot and likes drinking Guinness.
Yeah.
And the Muniswaran figure, right?
Yep.
And I use that as a representation of a whole range of figures of the underclass,
Right.
in general, and in particular Hindu, Tamil underclass. And there's not, resistance isn't built into that, but it's building a resource, a treasury for the future, for the present, to tell different kinds of stories. Now, what those stories end up becoming within the current racialized political context of Malaysia might, I mean, they might draw different kinds of stories. So they may not be particularly interested in the story of the underclass in itself, but it feels to me that needed stating.
I mean,
so it's, and finally, without taking any more time, there may be others who have questions, but the story you've told, and you are obviously aware of it in the book, is one of those stories that cannot be told by other means. There isn't a great deal of documentation, and the archival sources, the official archival sources, are not the most reliable. So you did what Sunil Amrid and Tim Tarper called the Tin Trunk Archives. And then you use ethnographic work, right? So there is enormous, I don't come from that perspective of I am Malaysian, just for that to be clear, and a scholar who's worked in Malaysia for a long time. So I don't come from that victimized, I don't adopt that victimized position in my work. In fact, work against that for a variety of reasons. So, but it feels like your work affords, for those who are interested, a lot of different kinds of knowledge making, knowledge production for the future. And I suspect there will be very interesting discussions if you had this in Malaysia with younger scholars and interested individuals who might not be seeing it just as a source of affirming a racialized Indian identity. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so many things there. So let me try and see how I can negotiate that. So, you know, this question of the underclass, right? That definitely came up in my conversations with my interlocutors. It was a very, very big part of that, and very strong awareness, you know, on the part of individuals who felt that they continued to constitute this kind of layer of working class, lower middle class, you know, category, and didn't see themselves going anywhere else, right? And of course, the racialized politics was so palpable. I mean, a lot of the stuff I was not even able to articulate because it would just have come across as inflammatory for the people who are articulating them. But we had some very impassioned conversations about this, right? For these individuals, the insistence on the link between the railways and the Indian community became a way of kind of overcoming the current status that they feel they have in Malaysian society, right? So that kind of became a way of, I mean, some might say that's a kind of escapism, you know? But I mean, while I have not yet had the conversations in Malaysia, and I'm planning to, but I have, in the course of the research that I was doing, I actually had very interesting conversations with younger members of these communities in temples. Like I would arrive in temples, and I think there's one temple story that I describe in Bukit Tembok, where I end up on a Sunday afternoon where the temple has organized flower arrangement classes for children from the neighborhood, right, whose parents work in the estates, many of them worked in the railways, etc., and they're all there. And, you know, on the spot, I'm asked to give a talk to them, and, you know, they say, can you talk to them? And you know, and so I did, and these were teenagers and young adults, many of them, group of 20, 25, maybe, many of them women, right? And on many occasions, many of us who've worked in these areas, we find ourselves in a situation like this where you are told to speak and you speak. And then, you know, I start about history and importance of remembering and voices, you know, all this stuff. And even as I was saying to them, they all sounded so vacuous and meaningless, you know, presented before this group, right? And indeed, you know, when I finished, there was silence. Nobody said anything. And I thought, okay, I've done really well. And then they began to talk, right? And one of the questions that came up was, you know, well, how is all this going to help us, right? I mean, it's a question we get asked all the time when you're working with certain constituencies. And, you know, of course, my response was that very honest. And I said, I can't, like this, not, because they would actually say, like, how is this going to change my material condition? How is it going to affect, you know, this, that, and the other? And of course, I had to say that it's not going to. And I came back to the crutch of history and, you know, like, we should remember, we should not forget. And, you know, your families, your father, your grandfather worked in the railways, worked in the estates and all. Don't you want your children to remember them and to know them? And, you know, some of them came around to that idea, but I really felt like a failure, you know, on that moment. And I felt the whole project was just meaningless to them. You know, that because it didn't deliver on what they saw as gaps in their everyday lives, right? So it seemed just too disconnected. But, you know, I carried on nonetheless. And I think at the end of it, I did find some alignment between some categories of people that I was talking to and the project who actually said that, you know, you should write about this because nobody talks about this, right? Of course, in the Malaysian context, things have changed even since my research was done, and there's a lot more public awareness, right? Just to give you one example, since the book was published, I've been approached by two gentlemen from Malaysia, both in their 70s, both who worked in the railways, both of whom have written their memoirs of working in the railways, right? And we're very happy that they came across this book. So, you know, I think that is the kind of conversation I want to have, you know. So I'm actually going to go to KL and meet up with them because, you know, I'd like to learn more. Of course, it'd be fascinating to meet the academics as well. I haven't had an opportunity, but I'm totally, you know, excited to present this work in Malaysia as well. And to have some I think the conversation will be very difficult. It will be much more difficult than it is here, right? Because people are very invested, and, you know, you mentioned the whole victim argument. I mean, there's some people who do, including scholars who take that position. So, you know, how does one talk how does one have a conversation with that constituency without diminishing their experiences, right? So I haven't yet organized it, but I definitely want to go to Malaysia. I mean, I started the talk by saying that I've talked about this in Europe and US, but I haven't talked about it in Singapore, and I'm very happy to do that here. I'm even more excited to do it in Malaysia.
Just because you raised apprehension, I'm going to take just a couple seconds. My purpose wasn't to raise the question of apprehension alone, because in my view, I think there's really a lot of room in various communities and people who are invested in, and a lot of appreciation for the kind of research that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there are people who really want to be thinking and talking outside of these racialized discourses. So
yeah, and I've connected with many of them.
I think you shouldn't just be feeling apprehension.
I'm not scared. I'm not scared of anything.
Yeah.
I mean, apprehension is not mine at all, right? So I look forward to that. I mean, you know, in any kind of a difficult situation, one finds a moment for conversation. So I look forward to that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have prepared a networking session. But before we enjoy the food, would you please join me to thank Professor Vineeta Sinha? Have a nice weekend.